A cold wind swept through the bustling downtown streets as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city. Marcus Jenkins tightened his worn-out jacket around his shoulders, trying to keep the chill at bay. The corners of his lips curved into a faint smile as he greeted passers-by, his voice calm, his demeanor unassuming. To most people, Marcus was just another face in the crowd, a homeless man who had probably seen better days. His thick beard and unkempt hair told a story of hardship, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. For weeks, Marcus had made the corner of 5th and Main his regular spot. He never begged aggressively or caused a scene. He simply sat quietly, observing the world around him. Few noticed the sharpness in his gaze or the subtle way he tracked the movements of everyone passing by. The truth about Marcus was hidden in plain sight. He was far from what he seemed. Officer Brad Cole, however, noticed Marcus in all the wrong ways. Brad had a reputation on the force, and not a good one. His badge often became a tool of intimidation rather than protection. Brad thrived on power, and his disdain for the homeless population was no secret. To him, Marcus wasn't a person. He was a nuisance, a blight on his city. That evening, as Brad patrolled the neighborhood in his squad car, his eyes landed on Marcus. He parked at the curb, the car door slamming loudly as he stepped out, his boots crunching against the pavement. Marcus barely glanced up, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Hey, you can't sit here," Brad barked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. Marcus looked up slowly, meeting Brad's glare with steady eyes. "I'm not hurting anyone," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. Brad's lip curled in disdain. "You people never learn, do you?" He muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. He took a step closer, the tension between them growing thick enough to cut with a knife. Several people walking by paused, their curiosity piqued. But Brad didn't care. He thrived on making an example of people like Marcus. What he didn't realize, however, was that he was about to pick a fight with someone far more capable than he could imagine. "Get up," Brad commanded, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. Marcus stayed seated, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Officer, I'm not doing anything wrong. Just sitting here, minding my business." Brad's patience was wearing thin. "I said get up." His voice was louder now, drawing the attention of more bystanders. Slowly, Marcus stood, towering over Brad. His presence, though calm, was imposing. He locked eyes with the officer, his expression unreadable. Brad hated the way Marcus didn't seem intimidated, and that only fueled his anger. "What's in the bag?" Brad asked, pointing to the old battered backpack at Marcus's feet. "Just some personal items," Marcus replied. "Hand it over," Brad ordered, stepping closer. Marcus hesitated. "That's not necessary." But Brad wasn't asking. He grabbed the bag, yanking it open. Inside, he found what he least expected: a neatly organized stack of documents, a badge, and a gun. His face twisted in confusion as he pulled out the badge. "What the—" "FBI." Brad muttered, the color draining from his face. Marcus folded his arms, his calm demeanor giving way to a quiet intensity. "I didn't want to do this, officer," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But you leave me no choice." Brad looked up at Marcus, his arrogance replaced by unease. The tables had turned, and the power he wielded so carelessly was now slipping through his fingers. The crowd around them grew larger, their murmurs growing louder. Marcus took a step closer, his voice low enough that only Brad could hear. "You're going to regret this." The scene froze in time, the air heavy with tension. No one watching knew what would happen next. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just another homeless man. This was a reckoning. Brad's hand trembled as he clutched the FBI badge, his mind racing to make sense of what he'd just uncovered. His entire demeanor had shifted from confident and domineering to stunned and unsure. He stared at Marcus, searching for answers, but the calm yet steely look on Marcus's face gave nothing away. The murmurs from the growing crowd buzzed around them like static, but Brad barely heard it. His instincts screamed for him to take control of the situation, to show strength. But how do you handle a man who wasn't what he appeared to be? A man who carried the authority of the federal government in his tattered bag? Brad finally found his voice, though it wavered. This has to be fake. There's no way. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression still composed. Do you really want to test that theory, officer? There was something unsettling about the way Marcus spoke. His tone wasn't threatening, but it carried an undeniable weight. Brad felt cornered, but he wasn't ready to back down just yet. He shoved the badge back into the bag and tossed it to the ground, as if discarding the evidence could undo what he'd seen. Doesn't matter who you think you are, Brad snapped, trying to regain control. You're on public property, loitering. I could still arrest you. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his calm exterior betraying just a flicker of irritation. Arrest me for sitting down. You're obstructing the flow of pedestrians. Brad's voice grew louder, more desperate, as though he was trying to convince himself as much as the crowd. A woman in the crowd spoke up. Obstructing pedestrians. Give me a break. He was just sitting there. You're the one causing a scene. Others chimed in, their voices growing in solidarity. The tide of public opinion was turning, and Brad could feel the pressure mounting. He was losing control of the narrative, and it only made him angrier. Marcus, however, remained focused. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and calm. Officer, I think carefully about your next move. You've already crossed a line, but I'm giving you a chance to step back. Take it. Brad's face turned red with frustration, but before he could respond, a voice crackled over his radio. Unit 24, what's your status? Over. He hesitated, glaring at Marcus as he grabbed the radio. Everything's under control. Over, he replied, his voice clipped. But everything was far from under control, and Brad knew it. He wasn't just dealing with a homeless man anymore. He was dealing with someone who had the power to unravel his career in an instant. Yet he couldn't afford to let this end here, not in front of all these people. His pride wouldn't allow it. Meanwhile, Marcus studied Brad closely. He could see the officer's internal battle playing out in his eyes. This wasn't just about ego. There was something deeper at play. Marcus had seen men like Brad before, men who used their positions of power to mask their insecurities. Men who were dangerous because they couldn't handle being challenged. As the tension lingered, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment to reflect on how he'd ended up here. The life of an undercover agent was unpredictable, but this assignment had been particularly grueling. Posing as a homeless man had been necessary to infiltrate a criminal network that operated in plain sight, using the city's streets as their playground. Marcus had spent months gathering intel, blending into the background, and earning the trust of those he was targeting. His work was dangerous, but he believed in it. What he hadn't anticipated, however, was becoming a target of the very system he was trying to protect. Encounters like this one with Brad weren't new, but they never got easier. Each one was a stark reminder of the prejudice and abuse that existed in the world he'd sworn to defend. But Marcus couldn't afford to let his emotions take over now. He had to stay focused. His cover wasn't completely blown yet, but the situation was precarious. If Brad pushed further, Marcus would have no choice but to reveal more than he wanted. And that could jeopardize everything. The crowd had grown restless, their voices a mix of curiosity and frustration. One man shouted, "Why don't you just leave him alone, officer?" Another added, "This is ridiculous. We're watching, you know." Brad glanced around nervously, realizing that every pair of eyes was on him. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was used to being in control, to having the upper hand. But now he felt like the walls were closing in. "Fine," he snapped, pointing a finger at Marcus. "But don't think this is over." With that, Brad turned and walked back to his squad car, his shoulders tense. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others murmuring words of encouragement to Marcus as they passed. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the adrenaline that had been building in his system begin to fade. He bent down to pick up his bag, brushing off the dirt where Brad had tossed it. As he slung it over his shoulder, he noticed a young boy watching him from across the street, his eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and admiration. The boy's mother gently tugged his hand, urging him to keep walking, but the boy called out, "Are you really in the FBI?" Marcus smiled faintly and gave the boy a small nod before turning and walking away. He could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him, but he couldn't dwell on it. There was still work to be done, and he couldn't afford any distractions. As he rounded the corner into a quieter alley, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The line clicked, and a voice on the other end answered. "Agent Jenkins, report." Marcus glanced over his shoulder, ensuring he was alone. "We've got a problem. My cover's been compromised, at least partially. I ran into some trouble with a local cop. Name's Brad Cole. He's not exactly a model officer." The voice on the other end sighed. "Do you think he suspects your operation?" "Not yet," Marcus replied, "but he's suspicious. And he's the type who doesn't let things go easily. I'll need to keep an eye on him." "Understood. Proceed with caution. We can't afford any setbacks." "Copy that," Marcus said before ending the call. He leaned against the brick wall, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time his cover had been threatened, but it felt different. The situation with Brad wasn't just about him. It was about the larger system that allowed people like Brad to abuse their power unchecked. And Marcus knew he couldn't let it slide. As he walked back toward his makeshift shelter for the night, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning. Brad wasn't the type to back down, and Marcus knew he'd be looking for any excuse to escalate things. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He'd faced tougher challenges before, and he wasn't about to let one corrupt cop derail his mission. Still, the path ahead was uncertain, and Marcus could only hope he'd be ready for whatever came next. The night was quieter now, the commotion from earlier fading into the hum of the city's usual noise. Marcus walked with purpose, his steps calculated but casual, blending seamlessly into the environment. He turned down a series of dimly lit alleys, eventually reaching a secluded spot beneath an overpass. To most, it would look like just another homeless encampment, makeshift tents, scattered belongings, and a small fire crackling in the center. But Marcus knew better. This was his staging ground. As he approached, a man sitting by the fire looked up. His weathered face broke into a grin, revealing a missing tooth. "You're late, Jenkins," the man said, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. "Ran into some trouble," Marcus replied, lowering his bag to the ground and taking a seat on a nearby crate. The man leaned in slightly, his grin fading. "The wrong kind of trouble, I assume." "Local cop. Brad Cole," Marcus said, shaking his head. "He's a hothead, but he's also persistent. Got too close for comfort tonight." The man nodded, pulling a cigarette from his pocket and lighting it. "Cole's been a problem around here for a while. Think he's more than just a nuisance." Marcus hesitated. "Could be. His behavior isn't just about ego. There's something else there. I'll need to dig deeper." The man took a long drag from his cigarette, his expression unreadable. "You think he's tied to the crew?" "It's possible," Marcus said, his voice low. "Or he's just another symptom of the rot in this city. Either way, I can't ignore him." The firelight flickered across the man's face as he studied Marcus. "Be careful, Jenkins. You're walking a fine line. We're too close to blow this operation now." "I know," Marcus replied, his jaw tightening. "But if Cole's involved, he's not just a loose end, he's a liability." As the two men spoke, the city carried on around them, unaware of the layers of conflict unfolding beneath its surface. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the night's events had set something in motion, something he couldn't yet predict. Meanwhile, across town, Brad sat alone in his squad car, parked outside a 24-hour diner. The badge he'd seen earlier kept flashing in his mind, its weight far greater than its size. He had spent the last hour convincing himself it was fake, that Marcus was running some kind of scam, but the doubt gnawed at him. Brad took a sip of his lukewarm coffee, staring out at the empty street. He always prided himself on being in control, on knowing exactly where he stood. But tonight had shaken him. Marcus wasn't like the others Brad had dealt with. He was confident, unshakable, and somehow familiar. Reaching for his phone, Brad opened a search app and typed in Marcus Jenkins FBI. He scrolled through the results, his brow furrowing. There were no obvious matches, but that didn't mean anything. If Marcus really was FBI, his profile would be buried deep. Frustrated, Brad slammed his phone onto the passenger seat. He couldn't let this go. If Marcus was lying, Brad would expose him. And if he wasn't, well, Brad wasn't ready to think about that yet. The next day, Marcus blended back into his role, sitting on the same corner as before. He greeted familiar faces with quiet nods, his eyes scanning the crowd for anything out of place. The tension from the previous night still lingered, but he couldn't afford to let it distract him. His mission was too important. As the morning passed, a young woman approached, her arms full of paper bags. She stopped in front of Marcus and smiled. "I brought some food," she said, setting the bags down beside him. Marcus looked up, his expression softening. "That's kind of you." "It's the least I can do," she replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I saw what happened last night. That cop was way out of line." Marcus nodded, choosing his words carefully. Not the first time someone's let power go to their head. The woman hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more. Finally she asked, "Are you really with the FBI?" Marcus's gaze met hers, and for a moment he considered deflecting. But something about her earnest expression made him decide otherwise. "Let's just say I'm not exactly what I seem." She nodded slowly, her curiosity clearly piqued. "Well, whatever you're doing, stay safe. People like him, they don't like being challenged." "Thanks for the warning," Marcus said, offering her a faint smile. As the woman walked away, Marcus's mind raced. The encounter had been brief, but it reminded him of the stakes. The people in this city deserved better. Better than cops like Brad and the criminals who thrived in the shadows. Later that evening, Brad found himself in a dimly lit bar, nursing a drink. He'd spent the day digging for information on Marcus, but he'd come up empty. Now he was venting his frustration to a fellow officer, a man named Dan. "You should have seen him," Brad said, his words slightly slurred. Sitting there like he owned the place, flashing some fake FBI badge. Dan raised an eyebrow. "Fake? You sure about that?" Brad scowled. What else could it be? A guy like that, dressed like that, doesn't scream federal agent. "Maybe not," Dan said, swirling his drink. "But if he is FBI, you might have just stirred up a hornet's nest." Brad's grip tightened on his glass. "He's not. I know he's not. I just need to prove it." Dan chuckled, but there was a note of caution in his voice. "Just be careful, Brad. You don't want to pick a fight you can't win." Brad didn't respond, but the warning lingered in his mind. As much as he wanted to dismiss it, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that Dan might be right. Back at the overpass, Marcus met with his contact again, their conversation tense. "The crew's making moves," the man said, his voice low. "Word is they're planning something big." Marcus nodded. "Then we need to act fast. I'll keep the cop distracted while we close in on the target." "You sure you can handle him?" the man asked, his tone skeptical. Marcus smirked. "I've handled worse." But as he said the words, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Brad Cole was more than just a distraction. The officer's persistence could become a serious problem. And in a city where nothing stayed hidden for long, Marcus knew that the collision course they were on would only end in one way, with the truth coming to light. Whether Brad or Marcus was ready for it, though, was another question entirely. The city seemed to hold its breath as the days passed, a quiet tension simmering beneath the surface. Marcus stayed in his role, moving through the streets with purpose, his eyes constantly scanning, his ears tuned to the smallest whispers. Every conversation, every interaction, every fleeting glance could hold a clue to the operation he was working to dismantle. Yet, no matter how focused he tried to remain, the shadow of Brad Cole lingered. The cop was a wild card unpredictable and dangerous in ways Marcus couldn't yet quantify. Brad, meanwhile, was spiraling deeper into his obsession. His attempts to dig up dirt on Marcus had turned up nothing concrete, and the lack of answers gnawed at him. He'd begun to make quiet inquiries within the department, careful not to raise suspicion, but every path seemed to lead to a dead end. It was as if Marcus Jenkins didn't exist before appearing on that street corner. The thought made Brad uneasy. If Marcus really was FBI, Brad knew he was in over his head. But the alternative, that Marcus was someone else entirely, felt even more unsettling. One evening, Brad decided to take matters into his own hands. He parked his squad car a few blocks away from Marcus's usual spot and watched from a distance. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the occasional sound of laughter or a passing car punctuated the quiet. Brad's fingers tapped restlessly against the steering wheel. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but he felt certain that if he stayed long enough, Marcus would slip up. As the hours dragged on, Marcus appeared, walking down the sidewalk with his usual calm confidence. Brad's pulse quickened. He watched as Marcus set down his bag and took a seat on the bench, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert. A few people stopped to talk to him. Some exchanged brief words, others handed him small items that disappeared into his bag. To an untrained eye, it might seem like nothing, but to Brad, it felt like something bigger was at play. Unable to contain himself any longer, Brad got out of his car and approached. Marcus saw him coming from a distance but didn't move. Instead, he waited, his expression unreadable. When Brad reached him, he stood silently for a moment, trying to gauge Marcus's reaction. "Back again, Officer Cole?" Marcus said finally, his voice calm but with a hint of amusement. "Starting to think you enjoy our little chats." Brad crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "I don't like loose ends, Jenkins, and you've got loose end written all over you." Marcus leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "Funny, I could say the same about you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Brad's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I know you're hiding something," he said, his voice low, "and I'm going to find out what it is." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his bag, slowly and deliberately, pulling out a small notebook. He flipped it open and began to write something down, ignoring Brad's growing agitation. "What are you doing?" Brad snapped. Marcus glanced up briefly, taking notes. "You're becoming a regular character in this story." Brad's face flushed with anger. "You think this is a joke?" "Not at all," Marcus replied, closing the notebook and tucking it back into his bag. "But you should know, officer, that you're not the only one watching." The cryptic remark made Brad's stomach churn. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "If you're trying to intimidate me, it's not working." Marcus held his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not trying to intimidate you. I'm trying to warn you. You're playing a dangerous game, and you don't even know the rules." Before Brad could respond, a loud crash echoed from a nearby alley. Both men turned instinctively toward the sound. Marcus was on his feet in an instant, his posture tense and alert. Brad hesitated, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "You stay here," Brad ordered, his voice firm. Marcus shook his head. "You don't know what you're walking into." "Stay here," Brad repeated, more forcefully this time, as he moved toward the alley. Marcus watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. He couldn't ignore the instinct that told him something was wrong. Against his better judgment, he followed, keeping a safe distance. The alley was dark, the faint glow of a streetlight barely illuminating the piles of trash and debris scattered along its length. Brad moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing the confined space. He reached for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of dripping water and the distant hum of traffic. Then a figure emerged from the darkness. Brad froze, his flashlight trained on a man holding a crowbar. The man's face was partially obscured by a hood, but his posture was aggressive. "Drop it," Brad commanded, his voice steady but tense. The man didn't move. Instead, he took a step forward, the metal of the crowbar gleaming in the light. Brad's hand went to his gun, but before he could draw it, Marcus stepped into the alley. "Easy," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "No one needs to get hurt." Brad whipped around furious. "I told you to stay out of this." Ignoring him, Marcus addressed the man with the crowbar. "Whatever you're doing here, it's not worth it. Walk away now, and we'll pretend this never happened." The man hesitated, his grip on the crowbar loosening slightly. But before he could respond, another figure appeared from behind a stack of crates. This one held a knife, and his eyes were fixed on Brad. "Two of them," Marcus muttered under his breath, his mind racing. The situation had escalated far faster than he'd anticipated, and now both he and Brad were in real danger. Brad's hand finally went to his gun, but Marcus grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Don't," Marcus said firmly. "Not yet." "They're armed," Brad hissed, trying to shake Marcus off. "And pulling your weapon will only make it worse," Marcus replied. "Trust me on this." Brad hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to take control, but something in Marcus's tone made him pause. It was the first time he'd seen the calm exterior slip, revealing a depth of experience that Brad couldn't ignore. The standoff stretched into seconds that felt like hours. The tension was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken threats. Marcus knew they were on the brink of chaos, and one wrong move could push them over the edge. But as he stood there, weighing his options, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random encounter. These men weren't just opportunistic criminals. They were part of something bigger. And whatever it was, Marcus knew it was about to come crashing into the light. The silence in the alley was broken by the faint sound of footsteps approaching from the far end. Marcus' attention flicked toward the noise, and he instinctively shifted his position, stepping slightly in front of Brad. The two men with weapons hesitated, their eyes darting toward the sound as well. It wasn't long before another figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man in a tailored suit, his presence immediately commanding. The glow from the street light caught the glint of something metallic in his hand. A sleek earpiece he pressed firmly into his ear before speaking. "Gentlemen," the man said, his voice smooth but cold, "let's not get carried away." The two armed men stiffened at his arrival, quickly lowering their weapons as if they had just been caught in the act. Marcus' eyes narrowed. He didn't need an introduction to know this man was someone significant, someone dangerous. The suit, the calm demeanor, the calculated entry, it all screamed authority. But what kind of authority remained a question. Brad glanced at Marcus, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Who the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath. Marcus didn't respond. He kept his focus on the man in the suit, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. The man met his gaze, a faint smirk playing on his lips as if he could read Marcus's thoughts. "Mr. Jenkins," the man said finally, his tone almost mocking. "Or shall I say, Agent Jenkins." Brad's jaw dropped, his confusion and anger spilling over. "Agent, you mean he really is?" "Quiet," Marcus snapped, his voice sharp. His mind raced as he tried to assess the situation. How did this man know his identity? And more importantly, what was his angle? The man in the suit took a step closer, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement. "You've been making quite the impression around here," he continued, addressing Marcus directly. "I think it's time we had a little chat, don't you?" "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. "Someone who knows the game we're playing," the man replied. "And someone who's very interested in seeing how it ends." Brad, still struggling to process what was happening, took a step forward. "All right, enough with the cryptic nonsense. Somebody better start explaining, and fast." The man barely spared him a glance. "You're out of your depth, Officer Cole. This isn't your fight." "That's where you're wrong," Brad shot back. "You show up in my city, in my jurisdiction, and threaten me." "Your jurisdiction," the man interrupted, a cold laugh escaping his lips. "This city hasn't been yours in years. You're just a pawn in a game you don't even understand. Brad bristled, his hand once again moving toward his gun. But Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a silent warning to stand down. Brad shook him off, glaring. "You've got some explaining to do, Jenkins," he said, his voice low. "Not now," Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving the man in the suit. The man tilted his head, observing the two of them like a scientist studying an experiment. "It's almost endearing," he said, his smirk widening. "The way you two bicker like old friends. But unfortunately, we're out of time for pleasantries." He raised his hand, and almost immediately, more figures emerged from the shadows, men and women in dark clothing, their movements precise and coordinated. They'd flanked the alley, cutting off any chance of escape. Brad swore under his breath, his fingers tightening around his gun. Marcus, however, remained calm, his mind working furiously to piece together the puzzle. Whoever this man was, he wasn't acting alone, and the fact that he knew Marcus's identity meant this operation was compromised in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. The man in the suit seemed to relish the tension. "You've stumbled into something much larger than you, Agent Jenkins. Something far beyond your little undercover games." "Enlighten me," Marcus said, his tone steady despite the odds stacked against him. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You've already done all the hard work for me. Tracing the crew, connecting the dots, they'll all lead to me eventually. But here's the thing, I control the board. And you're just another piece I'm about to remove." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "If that's true, why not take me out already? Why the theatrics?" The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "Because I want you to see what happens when someone oversteps. I want you to understand that this city belongs to me." He turned to the armed men who had initially confronted Marcus and Brad. "Bring them." Before Marcus could react, one of the figures lunged toward him. He moved swiftly, deflecting the attack and countering with a calculated strike that sent his assailant sprawling. Brad, despite his confusion and anger, found himself jumping into the fray, his instincts kicking in. Chaos erupted in the alley, but the overwhelming numbers quickly became apparent. Marcus and Brad fought with everything they had, but the coordinated efforts of their opponents soon had them outmatched. Within minutes, they were subdued, their hands bound behind their backs. As Marcus was forced to his knees, the man in the suit crouched in front of him, his expression one of triumph. "You see, Agent Jenkins, the problem with people like you is that you always think you're the hero. But heroes don't win. The ones who win are the ones willing to do whatever it takes." He straightened, signaling to his team. "Take them to the facility. We'll decide what to do with them later." As Marcus was dragged to his feet, he caught Brad's eye. For the first time, the cocky, hot-headed cop looked genuinely shaken. "You'd better have a plan," Brad muttered, his voice barely audible. Marcus didn't reply. He was too busy calculating, analyzing every detail, every possible move. Because one thing was certain, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The darkened facility smelled of damp concrete and machinery, the low hum of generators filling the silence as Marcus and Brad were shoved into a dimly lit room. Their captors moved with precision, their faces cold and unreadable as they secured the two men to metal chairs bolted to the floor. The man in the suit entered last, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, the sound echoing ominously. Marcus kept his composure, his mind racing. Every detail mattered now, the layout of the room, the number of guards, the faint creak of the door hinges behind them. Brad, on the other hand, looked like a storm about to break. His knuckles were white against the armrests, his eyes darting toward Marcus, as if begging for answers he knew he wouldn't get. Not yet. The man in the suit stopped a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've caused quite a stir, Agent Jenkins," he said, his tone casual but laced with menace. "But I have to admit, I'm impressed. Most of your kind wouldn't have gotten this far." Marcus didn't respond, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man. The calm facade was starting to crack. Barely noticeable, but it was there. A slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers fidgeted briefly before he forced them still. He wasn't as in control as he wanted them to believe. "You can drop the act," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "I've seen this play out before. You monologued about your grand plans, but the cracks are already showing. You're losing control, and you know it." The man's smirk faltered for a split second before he chuckled. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But boldness without power is meaningless." He stepped closer, his face now inches from Marcus's. "And right now, you have none." Brad finally snapped. "Who is this guy? What's going on here? I swear, if I don't start getting answers." "Shut up," the man interrupted sharply, turning to Brad. "You're nothing more than collateral damage in this. A loudmouth cop too stubborn to stay out of things he doesn't understand." Brad glared, but Marcus spoke before he could escalate the situation further. "If you wanted us out of the way, we'd already be dead. So why are we still breathing?" The man straightened, his cold smirk returning. "Because you're useful to me, Agent Jenkins, at least for now. You've uncovered more than I expected, and I want to know just how much you know." Marcus leaned back as much as his restraints allowed, his expression calm. "You want to know what I know? Fine. I know you've been smuggling arms through this city under the guise of legitimate operations. I know your network spans farther than you've let on, and I know you've got people in places they shouldn't be, people feeding you information." The man raised an eyebrow, feigning indifference, but Marcus caught a slight tension in his jaw. He pressed on. "And I know that no matter how powerful you think you are, someone above you is watching. Someone who won't tolerate the mistakes you've made." For the first time the man hesitated, his confidence faltering. Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping. "How long do you think you have before they decide your liability?" The tension in the room was palpable. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, and even Brad, despite his confusion, sensed the shift. The man in the suit tried to regain control, but before he could respond, a loud bang echoed from outside the room. Shouts followed, and the distant sound of gunfire grew louder by the second. The man's calm facade shattered. He barked orders to his guards, who scrambled toward the door. Marcus seized the moment, shifting his weight and twisting his wrists against the restraints. The guards had been thorough, but Marcus had learned a few tricks in his years undercover. With a sharp tug, a zip tie around his wrist snapped, and he was on his feet in an instant. Brad stared in disbelief. "How did you?" Later, Marcus said sharply, freeing Brad just as the door burst open. A team of armed agents flooded in, their movements swift and precise. Chaos erupted as the guards tried to fight back, but they were quickly overwhelmed. The man in the suit backed away, his confidence replaced by panic. "You set this up," he hissed at Marcus. "You were the bait." Marcus didn't deny it. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "And you walked right into the trap." Before the man could respond, one of the agents grabbed him, forcing him to the ground. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Brad stood frozen, his mind struggling to process everything. Marcus, however, was already moving, issuing commands to the agents and ensuring the room was secure. As the chaos settled, Brad finally found his voice. "So you were FBI this whole time, and you've used me as part of your sting operation." Marcus turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You weren't part of the plan, Brad. You stumbled into this on your own. But you helped, whether you realize it or not." Brad shook his head, still trying to make sense of it all. "So what happens now?" Marcus hesitated. The operation was technically a success, but something still didn't sit right. The man in the suit had been too confident, too certain of his position. And the way he'd spoken, like he was just another piece on someone else's chessboard, lingered in Marcus's mind. As the agents led the man out of the room, Marcus turned to Brad. "This isn't over. Not yet." Brad frowned. "What do you mean?" "You got him, didn't you?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "He's not the one pulling the strings." Before Brad could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his eyes narrowing as he read the message on the screen. A single line of text, unsigned but unmistakable in its warning. Asterisk, asterisk, you've only just begun to see the whole picture. Asterisk, asterisk. Marcus stared at the cryptic message glowing on his phone screen, his instincts immediately telling him it wasn't over. The rune had quieted as the agents cleared the scene, escorting the captured man and his remaining guards into waiting vehicles outside. Brad stood a few feet away, his expression still a mix of disbelief and frustration. He didn't know what to say anymore, and for once Marcus didn't either. The victory felt hollow, like a chess game won too easily, with pieces missing from the board. They left the facility under heavy escort, the early morning light filtering through the cracked city streets. Brad trailed behind Marcus as they walked toward one of the waiting SUVs, his silence unnerving. Finally, as Marcus reached for the car door, Brad spoke up, his voice low and edged with bitterness. "You're not going to tell me anything else, are you?" he asked. "You're just going to disappear, leave me in the dark, and go back to whatever secret world you came from?" Marcus paused, his hand resting on the door handle. He turned to face Brad, his expression softer now, the hard edges of his professionalism fading just slightly. "You've got questions," he said, "and you deserve answers. But some of those answers aren't mine to give." "That's not good enough," Brad shot back, his voice rising. "You dragged me into this without giving me a choice. I stuck my neck out for you because I thought I was doing the right thing. And now you're telling me this isn't over. What am I supposed to do with that?" Marcus sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. He'd seen this before, civilians, even local law enforcement, getting swept into the chaos of larger operations. They always felt used, discarded. He couldn't blame Brad for feeling the same way. "You were right about one thing," Marcus said. "This is your city. You care about it, even if you don't always go about it the right way. That matters." Brad folded his arms, clearly unimpressed. "Great pep talk, Jenkins. Doesn't exactly fix anything." Marcus took a step closer, lowering his voice. "The man we just took down is at the top of the chain. He's just a lieutenant, a pawn for someone much bigger. Someone with reach far beyond this city. I can't tell you everything because I don't have all the pieces yet, but I can promise you this. I'll keep digging, and if I need you again, you'll know." Brad scoffed, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You've got a funny way of asking for help, you know that." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Marcus's mouth. "I'll work on my delivery." With that, Marcus climbed into the SUV. Brad stepped back, watching as the convoy pulled away. He stayed rooted in place, staring after the vehicles until they disappeared around the corner. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, even if it was accompanied by frustration. Marcus might have left him with more questions than answers, but Brad couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. As the convoy sped toward the federal safe house, Marcus couldn't shake the ominous weight of the message on his phone. The man in the suit had said something about controlling the board, but now it was clear he was just another player. The real mastermind hadn't shown their hand yet, and that realization gnawed at Marcus. He knew this case would follow him long after the operation was officially closed. When they arrived at the safe house, Marcus was met by his handler, a no-nonsense woman named Director Claire Hensley. She'd been the one to approve his deep cover assignment months ago, and her piercing gaze told him she was already aware of the night's developments. "Good work," she said curtly as they entered the secure briefing room. "The suspect's in custody, and his network will start unraveling under interrogation." "It's not enough," Marcus said, his voice firm. "He's just a middleman. There's someone else pulling the strings, someone with more power and resources than we've accounted for." Claire raised an eyebrow. "And you think they'll make a move now?" "They already have," Marcus replied, showing her the message on his phone. "Whoever this is, they're watching us. They knew about the operation." Claire's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see the wheels turning in her mind. She handed the phone back, her tone clipped. "We'll trace it, see what we can find. In the meantime, you've done your part. Take some time off, Jenkins. You've earned it." Marcus nodded, but he knew he wouldn't be resting anytime soon. The loose threads of the case were too many, and he couldn't shake the feeling that pulling on one of them would unravel something much larger than they were prepared for. Back in his temporary apartment, Marcus sat by the window, staring out at the city skyline. The noise of traffic and distant sirens filled the air, a constant reminder of the chaos he'd been navigating for months. He thought of Brad, of the anger and confusion etched on his face as they parted ways. Marcus had been in his position before, caught in a web of secrets, unsure who to trust. He didn't envy Brad's position, but hoped the man would find his footing. The message on his phone continued to haunt him. Asterisk, asterisk, you've only just begun to see the whole picture. Asterisk, asterisk, it wasn't just a taunt. It was a warning. Marcus knew better than to ignore it. Whoever was behind it wasn't just watching. They were waiting. For what, he couldn't yet say, but he'd be ready when the time came. As the hours stretched into the early morning, Marcus finally leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling him. He'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. And while he didn't know what the future held, one thing was certain: he'd face it head-on, just as he always had. For now, the city was quiet, its tangled web of crime and corruption momentarily stilled. But somewhere in the shadows, a new game was already beginning, and Marcus Jenkins would be ready when it came to light.